The news of George Floyd's murder flowed in the day after my birthday. I woke up to the rest of the house already tuned in hearing the reports. I refused to look. I, unlike most of America, didn't need to see a cop kneeling on the neck of a black man for 7 minutes and 46 seconds to understand just how real the perpetual violence against black bodies in this country is, even by those sworn to protect us. When I returned to DC later that week on the first day of the protest, I got off of a plane and walked into a battlefield, unknowingly drafting myself into a war. It is easy to equivocate watching the news with having understanding, which can be a dangerous assumption in light of the misinformation and propaganda being employed daily to reinforce narratives of fear and division. Rather than the media inquiring about and highlighting the demands of the movement, the premier question is of whether the uprisings are peaceful protests or riots. However, these discussions deliberately overlook the fact that criminalization itself is constructed and now is actively being manufactured around demonizing us, Black people and deviant adjacents to the public. Our conceptions of violence itself are propagandized, and when it is branded underneath national security through US imperialism, establishing our capitalist hegemony and making the 1% richer, it is deemed permissible. But violence in response to an entire people's feelings of insecurity as they are actively being crucified under state-sanctioned terrorism? Unwarranted. Seemingly weighing Black life as worthless in comparison to capital. I implore you, forget your property. Looting is a legitimate form of protest in a country that values property over people, and it seems to get the public's attention more than the loss of Black life does. What you perceive as yours, by all accounts, is not. As a supposed nation on stolen indigenous land, prospering off of resources ruthlessly extracted from other countries, and enjoying most of our wealth as a direct consequence of enslaving millions of African peoples for labor, brutally killing millions, eradicating cultures, stealing lives, and embedding generational trauma that can still be found in our very makeup. Black anger is policed even more heavily than Black bodies. But how long are we supposed to wait patiently for the changes we need to ensure our most basic security? What much of this country doesn't understand is this war did not start with us, but rather has been declared on Black communities since this country's creation. I understand that these, for many, can be hard truths, but for marginalized peoples, these are the realities we live the implications of every day. But make no mistake, I too, while young and unenlightened, strictly subscribed to notions of violence not being the answer, and two wrongs don't make a right. Because honestly, we associate darkness with violence, savagery, uncivilization, but dissociate these concepts from white men and people in positions of power, even as their hands are tightening around our throats. So I adopted the respectable nonviolence theory. And it was not until I would arrive at Georgetown that I would realize that this could not always apply in liberation work. Despite what you may gather at first glance, I am biracial, half Black and half white. I have had the heated discussions about privilege and the Black Lives Matter movement with family members I grew up with. I find myself constantly met with disbelief, as my family struggles to understand how it is that I have essentially transformed into an insurgent. But it was no coincidence that I, in contrast to my white family, grew such unrest in my heart and revolutionary spirit in my soul. The nature of my experiences, my Blackness, served as the catalyst for my radicalization. Now, I certainly possess many privileges alongside my marginalizations, and I acknowledge my limitations in representing all of my community. Nevertheless, our hegemonic media sources are dominated by white voices, and white narratives of Black people's stories are never going to be truly representative of our experiences. This is my attempt at reclaiming this narrative, and I hope to, through sharing some of my experiences, explain the phases that got me from where many of you are sitting to where I am standing with my fist raised. Phase 1, I commenced my formal involvement with partisan politics in desperate search of like-minded people, and my understanding of political participation then meant that I had two options, and I was not choosing the right thing. So I joined my political club of choice on campus, and as the issues with diversity and inclusion within the organization began to arise, I convinced myself that they're fixable, that liberals are fundamentally different from conservatives and capable of doing the work in a more promising way. And I may not have been wrong, but I certainly overestimated their desire to do so, letting my hope cloud my better judgment. I went on to be Vice Chair and Director of Advocacy, as well as the spearhead of the Diversity Commission, where I felt my work to be constantly underacknowledged, as I, the only Black girl on the board, was tasked with juggling the largest department and actively creating and running the commission. I grew increasingly frustrated with the apathetic nods I would get during our general body meetings when I would speak of the importance of diversity and inclusion work, as I knew that those same nodding heads would vanish when the commission meeting times would come. Even among liberals, the woke ones, who undoubtedly would agree that Black Lives Matter and be sure to employ politically correct rhetoric, few were actually willing to show up and shoulder the work alongside me. There was an elaborate culture of performing care. But in reality, my presence only mattered to tick a diversity box. The following semester, I had an unsettling encounter with police in my dorm room, and was met with no compassion from the organization when I missed an event the following morning, only solidifying what I had already been feeling and struggling to come to terms with. There was a fundamental sense of indifference towards the toils of Black people. Phase 2, I moved on to work with other survivors of sexual harm, particularly Black women and non-binary people. In response to the lack of resources and recognition for our community, we drafted a list of demands to the university, asking for what most would consider the bare minimum, requiring comprehensive diversity, bias, and bystander training for all faculty, staff, and deans, hiring Black clinicians, establishing appropriate and adequate resources for the safe transportation on campus, hiring a Black trauma specialist, and mandating a commitment to bolstering the off-campus mental health stipend meant to fill the gaps of the short-term care on campus. This initial list of demands, despite the countless hours we attributed to its creation and the descriptive nature of what our community required, was met by no significant action on the part of the university. Instead, they published a response delineating actions they had already taken, such as hiring for positions that are required on university campuses, and birthing more task forces we did not ask for, with no stated intention of continuing the work to address the harm in the ways the community was begging. In fact, we did not even receive the response personally. It was sent to various notable Black leaders on campus, most of whom had no part, some of which had no knowledge of the creation of these demands. And none of this is a coincidence or a slip-up by the university, but rather a continuation of their trend of deflecting blame and evading action, a concerted effort to undermine our organization and disintegrate our movement. Administrators have admitted to our organizers through Freudian slips that they have known of these issues and how they have particularly been pervasively affecting Black femmes, that these have been points of contention for years, with various movements for equity over the last decade, and through all of this, Georgetown sat idly. These harms were allowed to fester and infect us, and when we provided the answers to the questions they refused to even ask themselves, they were unwilling to do the work to remedy the pain. That is, until we initiated a sit-in outside of the president's office for a week, 9 a.m. to midnight, and they could no longer ignore us. It was not until we were at their doorstep necessitating their addressal of our demands that we were able to make any progress. Within that week, we had more than half of our demands met and created more fundamental change than had been done for the Black femme community in years. by administration. We tried the respectable passive route, but when you do not have the power, the elite has no reason to even sit at the table with you, much less to listen and change. We had to take direct actions and make ourselves unavoidable to even reach the ears of those who were meant to serve us. Phase 3, now we will hit the fast forward button for the last time to the beginning of the DC uprisings, where my weakened but still rooted high school whims of nonviolence theory decidedly clashed with praxis. Every time my comrades and I left our doorsteps, there was an unspoken understanding that there was a target on our backs. We felt danger from all angles, avoiding the alt-right trying to dox us and the white supremacists looking for game, all to fight for our right to live. And that is not to speak of the violence we face standing toe-to-toe with law enforcement every single day, as they intimidated us, restricted our right to protest, and blocked off community areas and resources. They pushed us further and further back each time we went until we were moved from in front of the White House to I and 16th 2 blocks down. Aside from the suppression of our voices, we found that regardless of how peaceful we presented ourselves to be, our blackness was enough to warrant a threat. I will never forget leaving a march at the Lincoln Memorial early, a march that had proclaimed itself committed to nonviolence and proving the media wrong, and not getting even a block away before a sea of law enforcement officers swarmed and maced the demonstrators, forcing the crowd to disperse in pain and fear. I've seen crowds have multiples of tear gas canisters and internationally banned chemical weapon thrown at them as they chant "hands up, don't shoot" and peaceful protests. I watched a man pour his heart out at a line of officers in front of Lafayette Park, standing feet away from them, saw as they began to shoot rubber bullets at him, and beside him, I screamed for them to stop. Instead, they shifted aim. I was shot twice by bullets encased in rubber and coated with pepper spray, and I have a scar on the back of my arm that will likely never heal, not to mention the emotional scars that I know won't. The violence on the part of protesters is always reactionary, contrary to what the media may influence you to believe, not only because the uprisings are a direct response to the mutilation of Black bodies, but also because we will always be diminished as threats, warranting to the public any kind of violence against us. I can guarantee that at 5-3, I was not a threat to a line of police officers in riot gear. It does not matter whether we put our hands up, identify ourselves as peaceful, or push back, regardless, violence is what we face. We have nothing to lose but our chains. What is radical to you is necessary to me. I had no choice but to be radical by virtue of my identities as a queer person, a Black woman, a poor person. My life experiences have taken me from the blissful ideas of nonviolence to a much harsher understanding that my body, my life, will have to be on the line to ever see the changes I desire. I am still not violent. I have still never been in a fistfight. But participating in, believing in this movement, while it may seem like a choice, is a responsibility. My responsibility, though it should be ours. My identities were the catalyst towards my radicalization, but I hope that even for those who are not bound by identity to a radical politic, that they feel called in. No violence caused by these uprisings can ever supersede the carceral state's violence on our lives as Black people day in and day out. We cannot just wait anymore. We clearly cannot rely on policymakers to have anyone's interest in mind but the elite, and cannot expect the police state to dismantle itself. So what can we do when we've tried peace, only to be blatantly met with disregard, when we do not see ourselves and our needs reflected in the systems we are meant to live complacently underneath? So frankly, I urge you to forget the rhetoric of riots versus peaceful protests. The civil rights movement was a riot. Stonewall was a riot. The arguments for peaceful protests stem from a position of privilege, but for communities like ours, we either accept that we will not be listened to, be spoken over, or we fight. The reach of this movement, the power of this movement is unprecedented. It represents an incredible opportunity to demand structural change. Fixation on the means with no context to how we got here or regard to how expeditious progress has only been made through these means. And that is belittling to us and to all who have struggled for our collective liberation before us. Myself and my friends, all college-aged, were effectively molded into soldiers in a war many of us were born into just by virtue of being Black. Direct your energies and your frustrations towards that. Towards the fact that students are taking to the streets because we refuse to see a day where our children have to live under these same conditions. We've been declared enemies of the state and treated as such in every interaction. One could say that we are fundamentally oppositional to the state because inherent to the state is white supremacy. Inherent to the state is racial capitalism that, so long as it is in existence, will thrive off of the backs of Black people and their oppression. One could say that we are enemies of the state because believing in Black life is antithetical to the very foundations this country is built upon. We threaten your racist institutions, customs, and culture. We are pushing you to where you are uncomfortable. I acknowledge this and how it may be jarring. However, none of the aforementioned are worth more than people's lives, especially not your comfortability. To prioritize your need for security and privilege in the wake of the subjugation of Black people is to not only validate, but to embody the oppressor. It is imperative that we allow Black people to control the own narratives of their experiences. It is important across all identities to turn to Black people for the first time in our country's history to lead a revolutionary movement. It is due time to take up a spear in our defense, as we say on the streets, not as an ally, but as an accomplice, while allowing us to forge the path to our own freedom. The work isn't dictated by your comfortability and doesn't stop despite who holds presidential office. It stops when Black people stop dying. So where do you fit in? Use this time to educate yourself, not by expecting Black people's emotional labor, but with a simple Google search and a little intention. Acknowledge your own privileges and the responsibilities that come with them, whether you are white, upper class, able-bodied, a citizen, straight, a student. We all have a point of privilege from which we can build power for the marginalized. Now more than ever, it is time to figure out where you plug into the movement. Whether it is through taking to the streets yourself or continuing to donate to bail funds and BLM-related GoFundMes, making calls to relevant offices, demanding justice, routinely calling out racism and microaggressions as you see them, getting involved with community mutual aid, spreading social awareness through public education, or any other mechanisms for change. But most important of all, if you take nothing else from this talk, remember that the path to Black liberation is not yours to choose. Thank you.